Hello, this is episode 8 of The Grief of Politics. I am Joseph Carlson. Joining me once again is Avin Carroll. Avin, how are you doing?
Doing great today. Glad to hear you are as well. I was about to ask again.
Yeah, it's fine. We were just talking before this. This time was my turn to pick. This is episode 8. I picked Texas because it just keeps coming up in the news. And I realize I kind of sent 2 duds of articles in the beginning. I sent 4. We could probably weed through the first 2. I know this happens with every state, but I think it is interesting how people write and they have to make a chart to realize how weird states are. They do it with every state. Business Insider did this article. They basically rank Texas pretty weird. Now, Avin, last month, I was kind of on the edges of an expert of the topic. We did abortion. I'm obviously open about my grief and what I've gone through. You have lived in Texas, so since you are kind of on the edges of an expert this week, what do you think about Texas being weird? Just a general weird, good, bad Texas? What do you think?
Yeah, Texas is, unique. Every single state has their own unique things that they're known for. Things that they do. Sometimes it's just geography. Sometimes it's unique things within the culture, right? Like South Dakota, we think of Mount Rushmore. But that's about it, because, it's Dakota.
Yeah, really, that's what we think of. Good or bad, Mount Rushmore.
Yeah. Montana, we think of high-speed freeways and very libertarian, political policies.
Right.
Washington, people think about Microsoft and Boeing and Amazon and the Space Needle.
Coffee.
Right. Coffee. Lots of coffee.
It's
and
so
rain.
Much.
Right?
As a side story, I went to San Francisco and I bought coffee, and the guy went into detail about the coffee, and I thought, I'm from Seattle. Well, I'm from the Washington State, and we know coffee, and this guy just out-coffeeed me. He went on and on about what needed to happen to the coffee. And I thought, I just want an Americano, man. This doesn't
just because you live here doesn't necessarily mean that you are a snob.
That's right. It's weird. It's I thought I knew about coffee. This guy had proved me. He's like, no, you're JV League, man.
You think about Texas, and there's so many different things you think about. You think about cowboys and people carrying guns and
there's an article
riding horses.
It's one of the articles that I sent.
It is one of the articles that you sent, and it is a stereotype within Texas. And you think of.
I just want to be clear. There's a difference between a stereotype and a law that got passed.
Correct. But I'm talking about the things we think about when we think about Texas. Yeah. We will discuss the law that passed later. There's all this image of Texas, and you talk to Texans, and they consider themselves Texans. And I had a friend here in Washington. He's since moved to Oregon, who, when his son was born, having lived up here in Washington, he had his parents ship him soil from their land in Texas so that the first soil his son's feet touched was Texan soil.
Wow.
They take it really seriously.
That's a level, man. That's a level. That's a new level.
Texas really considers themselves, a part of the United States, but separate. And
they kind of are, and that's why I wanted to do the episode, because the more and more you read about it, it is like this weird experiment that I've talked about before, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do it, because it keeps coming up, and I'm just like, this is like an anomaly.
And then you got brisket. It's gigantic. If you haven't been to Texas, it's really hard to understand how big Texas is.
Well, it's like the second most, isn't it like the second most populated state, I think?
It's the second most populated state, but I think it's the second largest geographically state, too, after Alaska. And having driven across just a small portion of Texas when I moved in and then moved back out, it's huge. This tiny little section from Dallas to Amarillo that I drove that takes about 3-4 hours or something is this tiny little section, and yet from Washington I could drive from Seattle to Spokane in almost the same amount of time, which is crossing the majority of the state.
Right.
Until you go all the way out to the coast, and then that gets different. But
right.
It really puts into perspective how big it is. My mom tells the story of when my stepfather drove across the state, and it took him like 2 days to cross.
Whoa.
Now, he's not driving all the way through. They would stop,
Right.
because that's how he drove. But
That's crazy. And you've gone across the state to like Idaho, Washington anyway, and
Yep.
I mean 2 days you're in Idaho already. And, you
2
know,
days? What are you talking about? It's an 8-hour drive from
Right.
9-hour drive from Seattle to Boise.
So if you got to do like the corners of Texas, you're looking at that's crazy.
It's if you're going from the widest point to the widest point, it is a long drive, and it's a state that a lot of the freeways have 70-mile-an-hour speed limits, and everyone speeds. So, my experience with Texas was in Dallas and the surrounding suburbs, and Fort Worth. And the DFW, Dallas-Fort Worth area, is one of the largest metropolitan regions in the country. They call it the Metroplex. There's a ton of cities in that Dallas-Fort Worth region. They're all interlinked by these, circling freeways. It's the largest inland port in the country. And all of this adds to its own very unique culture. Dallas has its own culture separate from Houston because they have very different industries that they focus on.
Yeah, we'll talk about some of those in the episode.
And then you have Austin, which thinks it's like Portland because it also wants to stay weird.
I did hear a comedian make a good joke about, are we really that excited about 8 blocks? Like, he talked about Austin, and I mean, he was a comedian, so he doesn't live there, but he's obviously probably gone there to shows and probably went through Austin, was like, this is it, huh? This is what we're all so excited about, it's not it's beautiful, but really, guys?
Well, and it's humid, and there's different climates within the state. Like, the whole state of Texas is its own very unique thing, and everyone in Texas, like even my friends, when I moved down there, I moved with some friends, and my friend, when I talk to him, he considers himself a Texan now, and it's a different thing to consider yourself a Texan. There's a point of pride. So anyway, from my own perspective, Texas is definitely unique and weird, but then I'm comparing it to Washington, specifically Western Washington, where we have our own brand of weirdness.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I mean, every state really does. I mean, even if you think I haven't traveled to the middle of the country, but people would think that's everywhere. But I do think with Texas, again, reading more and more about it, I texted you before this, a few days before this. I wasn't late. I was really reading all this stuff, and it's one thing to where do you start with the grand experiment that is Texas? Where do you start with this, whatever? And I kind of just stuck for recent events because I didn't want to go
in depth,
to the Alamo or something. Yeah. The what?
In depth into why the Texas is weird the way it is.
Right. And, so I guess we could just get in. So the first article that I have, I'll just, I don't really want to go over the two. Basically, there was a Business Insider article that talked about there was a way to rate each state by weirdness. They had another article that you clicked on that talked about the ways that they ranked it. And it was just something to be like, oh, so this is a thing and Texas is bad. I don't think that that's one of the biggest, whatever. I don't know. It's not one of the biggest things, it's, I don't know. It was this thing to say, yeah, this is pretty weird, I mean, reading that, do you have any thoughts? I mean, again, I don't want to read it verbatim because basically it says, well, check out this other article and this is how we rated it. But I don't know. To me, it was just yeah, this place is pretty weird. And I think the other articles we'll talk about later will go into why it is weird. So reading that article, did it incense you? Were you like, this is meh?
Not really, no. I mean, it all makes sense from what I experienced when I was living there. And I don't know, maybe we have a negative association with being weird. But...
Because weird means bad usually, right?
Yeah. And as human beings, we positively associate things that are like us. So something that is not like us, weird, we are inclined to maybe think it's a negative thing. But interestingly enough, it's coming from a Texas paper.
Right. And that was one
kind of
thing about the
embracing it.
articles that the one thing about the articles I found, it was from the Texas Tribune, which I'm not from Texas. I don't know if it's considered a liberal paper or a conservative paper, but it is something that's published in Texas. So obviously, we've read the local paper here. You definitely have a different perspective than as opposed to the New York Times writing about Texas or the Washington Post writing about Texas. You know what I mean? Like the Texas Tribune writing about Texas is definitely going to have a different, unique perspective about.
So this particular article that Joe's talking about is from the Statesman, statesman.com. It was written by Hannah Thornby. It was updated on September 27th of 2018. So
Right.
it's an older article. The statistics may be a little bit off, but they rated Texas as the 39th most normal. So close to being in the weirder, or definitely in the less normal, more weird category. They only highlight a couple of things specifically outside of the norm. Specifically, they highlight that Texans have Texas in 2014, so 7 years ago, had one of the highest rates of not having health insurance at 19.1% of Texans without insurance. And then they highlighted the population. At that time, it was 27 million for the state, and that was number 2 in the country. Now, again, this is 7 years ago. We've had a new census since then. The numbers have likely changed.
I think they said that. The one thing I didn't send you, there was a thing about them. Maybe I just didn't bring it up, but there's an idea that the Texas Board of Education is changing some of the standards in education. Did I send you that? That they're voting to remove the teaching of the KKK, basically.
Mm.
I'd have to find the.
I don't
I'd
remember
have to
you sending that, but I do know that's a thing because it was discussed. I mean, there's been discussion of adjusting curriculum in Texas for years.
Right. The article that I read was it was from a Texas paper, I believe, and it quoted the bill, and some of the things are very good. It's like, we're going to teach more about minorities and disenfranchised people. That has to be included in your history curriculum. And you read it and say, well, that sounds good. But then you get to the next part, and it says, and we want to remove any mention of the KKK or, and you're like, wait, what? How did that get slipped in? Like, you were doing so well at the beginning of this. I don't understand what to hear. And yeah, again, this was just, I don't want it to be an anecdote, but it was the idea that it is such a strange thing to me to be this really, like, so proud of who you are. And then, they have, like, the highest population of Hispanic people, which makes sense because they border Mexico, and, like, the idea that you don't want to teach to people or don't want to speak to people's experiences that are people of color in your own state of, like, well, we're not going to mention all this bad stuff,
I mean,
and to me that was kind of troubling. So
at a larger scale, we call that nationalism.
Yeah, it's not good.
We teach the exceptionalism of our countries, and to a degree, it's not necessarily a bad thing having pride in your country and what your country's done, but it definitely does get dangerous when you start ignoring the bad things that your country's done, right? Like, Japan not teaching fully the
World War II.
Yeah.
Or even Germany, there's those reports that, like, people didn't know, like, right after the war, they were like, they didn't know what the SS was doing, and they had to, like, learn in classrooms, like, no, this is what happened, and they're like, oh, like, it's pretty bad. Speaking of people's rights, I think I want to do the other article now, which is...
Well, 2 more.
Do you want to read it, or you want me to read it?
Which one are we talking about?
Oh, sorry, the handgun one.
Okay. You can go for it.
Okay. Yeah, this is, again, written by the Texas Tribune. Again, I'm not from Texas. I don't know. Have you heard of the Texas Tribune when you were there? Do you know if it's more right-leaning or left-leaning, or is it?
Nope, no idea.
Yeah. Anyway, this is written by Sammy Sparber on June 16, 2021. It was updated at 5 p.m. Central Time, which is ironic because, not ironic. Texas is, like, right dab in the middle. So it's entitled, Texans Can Carry Handguns Without a License or Training Starting September 1st. after Governor Gary Abbott signs permitless carry bill into law. Texans can carry handguns without a license or training starting September 1st. Yeah, that's basically just a headline. House Bill 1927 eliminates the requirements for Texan residents to obtain a license to carry handguns if they're not prohibited by state or federal law from possessing a gun. The signing was reported by the Texas Legislature official website, which tracks the progress of legislation. Abbott's office has announced a ceremonial signing of the bill and other gun-related legislation at 11 a.m. Thursday. I don't know how much more of this I want to read. Basically, you don't have to, you don't have to go through a training course or anything to carry a gun now, which to me is troubling. I listened to the Free Range American podcast, ex-military. They run Black Rifle Coffee Company. The co-founders are on there, and even they're ex-military, and they're like, they're in Texas, and they're like, I'm a little worried of giving someone a gun without making them go through a basic safety course, and obviously being concealed carry is, I think, something to be worried about. So, when the former military is talking about it, like, hey, maybe we should just make people go through a safety gun course or something, So
this particular one is a weird one for me, because I'm like, why would you do this? When my friends and I moved to Texas,
I met some of them at your wedding too. I mean, they were like, yeah, I want people to be responsible. I carry a gun. I went through a course.
Exactly. And
I was like, that's fine.
The husband had a CCP up here in Washington, had a concealed carry, and then moved down to Texas and was like, all right, well, I need to get my concealed carry right away so that I can carry in Texas. Right. So relatively quickly went through the process of figuring out what he needed to do, and was vocal about how getting your concealed carry permit in Texas was actually more difficult than it was in Washington. And Washington being a liberal state with a large amount of the population being very pro-gun control.
Right, you'd think it would have been the other way.
You would expect it to be the other way. The thing was, in Texas, in order to get your concealed carry permit, you had to do a written test and a practical test. And you had to go through a class where you're actually taken out and taught how to use the gun, how to fire the gun, and how to shoot. And then you have to pass a shooting test.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Which, I mean, it seems extremely common sense when you're, using something that kills people. We do it for cars, and the reason we do it for cars is because if you screw up, you kill people. Yeah. So I don't understand this push. I really don't understand this push to make it permitless, with no requirement other than being legally allowed to. So they're still doing whatever base level background check that they do, but right. You no longer have to have any other special certification, license, approval to
it's basically, that you can point to problems in the waiting list and the background checks, but this would be another level, right? Mm-hmm. And by removing that, if those fail, then you have nothing really, right? Instead of that other layer of protection to be like, well, this person fibbed the paperwork, or it was Friday. I mean, I've heard those stories, or gun stores will sell things out the back door. There's anecdotes like that. Like, this is just another layer of protection, and it is gone now. So.
And this particular article doesn't do a very good job of going into kind of the counter arguments of like why.
Well, it does say that it'll lead to more deaths, and.
Well, it does discuss the reasons not to do the bill, but it doesn't do a very good job of explaining the arguments for passing the bill, other than highlighting some quotes about Abbott caving to the pressure of the gun lobby.
I want to read. I think this is a pretty good quote. This is a quote from. I'll just read it. Quote: "The permitless carry bill will cause more violence and loss," said U.S. Representative Veronica Escobar, Democrat from El Paso, in a statement Wednesday. Despite overwhelming support for common sense gun violence prevention legislation like universal background checks, Texan Republicans led by a cowardly governor are more interested in groveling for the gun lobby's attention than they are in preventing gun violence and honoring victims and survivors in El Paso and across Texas.
So that's a plainly political statement coming from a political opponent to,
Right.
it's a Democratic legislator within, or representative within Texas, bad mouthing the Republican governor of Texas, and this is what you would expect in that language. It doesn't actually speak to what the real reasoning is behind wanting to pass this. It does allude to the only reason is because, quote, the gun lobby is...
also, it says here, Texas does not require a license to open carry a rifle in public.
Correct.
Which seems odd.
Doesn't Oregon do the same thing, though?
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, that I don't know.
There's a lot of states that have
again,
open carry rules because it's obvious that the person's carrying a gun.
Yeah, like that's true. You don't have a concealed permit for a rifle. That's like it's strapped to your back. You know, people would kind of see.
Like I even think up until recently, Washington was an open carry state. As long as it wasn't concealed,
oh yeah,
could carry.
I've seen people like. I was at a restaurant and somebody came in and open carried, and a friend of mine who's a gun owner was like, "Why would you do that?" Like, I get concealed carry, but like he had it strapped to the back of his hip. Mm-hmm. So you're basically like advertising to everybody like I have a gun, and that's weird.
Well, and there's an argument to be made for that, but still, like that is one thing. What I was bringing up is this particular article does not do a very good job of positioning why they would want to have it that way, other than maybe it is a view that constitutionally there should be little or no regulation on the right to carry. I personally don't really agree with that. I actually really liked the Texas system for concealed carry permitting and really appreciated the fact that in order to get your concealed carry, you had to go through a class. You had to receive education on how to use a gun, because I'm very much in support of that concept of like, you need to understand, one, you need to prove that you can responsibly handle a gun, and two, you need to prove that you understand the rules and laws around carrying that gun, like we do with the vehicle. I don't think it's that big of a deal, but with many freedoms and rights, there is this feeling within conservative groups that is growing. At least my own perception of following and reading more conservative publications, that every rule or law that limits a right is just the government moving more and more and more and more and more to taking our rights away. And there's a balance in that. Like Penn Jillette and his whole like libertarian philosophy, right? Like we need just enough laws to be one step short of chaos, anarchy. I disagree with him. I don't think that's true. But there's a large feeling within conservative people to kind of move in that direction. Let people have their free will. Let people do what they want to do.
You're seeing it now with COVID. It's a common refrain that you hear about. This takes away my personal rights.
Mm-hmm. And I think that sort of budding feeling, that growing belief structure within our country is bleeding into other aspects of it with this. And this is purely speculative. I haven't read any other research that actually goes in the arguments for 100% permitless carry. But it still seems weird to me. Like, why?
I have to be honest. I tried to look for the procon.org thing of this, and I didn't see, which makes me sad. Now that we do these episodes, if there's not a procon.org article, I get somewhat sad. We're like, darn it!
Did you open and look at the poll that they have listed in the article?
No, they're like, well, most people said that they they don't want this to. They obviously don't want. Where is it? I just was looking at it.
Most Texas voters don't support unlicensed handgun carry in the University of Texas Texas Tribune poll. Though the idea is popular with a 56% majority of Republicans, so not a huge majority, but a majority within the more conservative party, 59% opposed unlicensed carry, a number driven up by 85% of Democrats who oppose it, which 100% doesn't surprise me at all. On the Republican side, the gun questions revealed a gender gap. Among Republican men, 70% said they supported unlicensed carry, and 49% of Republican women oppose that position. More people carrying guns would make the United States safer, according to 34% of Texas voters, while 39% said it would make the country less safe. 16% of Texans felt it would have no impact on safety. That being, should carry more guns or not.
Yeah, it's to me it's strange. Again, it's this strange experiment of Texas of like, okay, I guess we'll see what happens. You know, you're trying this. It's incredibly bold. I don't agree with it, but we'll see. You know,
I mean, it's the opposite position of what we've seen in more liberal cities and states, right? We talk about Chicago having some of the strictest gun laws in the country and some of the highest gun violence. Maybe Texas is like, well, we're just going to go the opposite direction. We're going to have some of the most lenient gun laws in the country and see if that reduces gun violence.
I mean, yeah, that's the experiment, you know. Well, you know, again though, I would like to point out, being the liberal hippie, that Texas is different than Chicago. Everybody always tries to equate, you know, like, oh, look at all this. Like it's a different city. There's this different, you know,
different dynamics, pasts, histories. No, I mean everyone that quotes gun violence statistics points to Chicago.
Yeah.
Because it's the most famously discussed one. And to be honest, I've never dug into those numbers, so I don't even know how accurate they are. They easily could be skewed talking points because it's not hard.
Well, it seems like it goes both ways. Like, yeah, you could pretty much pick out of there what you want. But I think we should get to the other article, which really kicked me kind of thinking about this, was the Winter Storm 2021 and the fact that Texas power grid just totally was decimated by the storm. Thousands and thousands of people were without power. This is an incredibly long article. I'm not going to read all of it. This is kind of after the storm. This is, again, from the Texas Tribune. It just happened to be the hit when I was like looking through this stuff. Oil and gas interests left to, quote-unquote, self-regulate in aftermath of winter storm as Texas politicians pile on to the ERCOT, which is the regulatory committee in Texas. And, yeah, when you read this article, I'll just read the first couple paragraphs. After being battered by a withering criticism of its management of the power grid during last month's winter storm, the Electronic Reliability Council of Texas saw several of its board members resign and fire its CEO. The chair of the Public Utility Commission, which oversees the grid operator, was forced to resign. The political fallout from the long-lasting Texas power outages have hit both entities hard after Governor Greg Abbott blamed ERCOT's leadership for the near collapse of the electric power grid and made it reform a legislative priority. A state lawmaker hampered the PUCs for what they call a failure of oversight. Yet political powerful natural gas companies, along with the regulators, appear so far to have escaped the wrath of the government and the legislator. This is an incredibly long article. It goes on and on about like what happened, how many megawatts of power these produced, how that breaks down between natural gas and wind energy and nuclear. But yeah, it does seem weird. A lot of people have pointed out there's like someone has a quote here. There was a lot of shrugging and finger pointing to electricity generators, said Adrian Shelley, director of Public Citizens of Texas a Texas consumer advocacy group. There's not a clear fall guy on the oil and gas fuel side of things, in the way that ERCOT is taking the brunt of the responsibility on the transmission side. I don't think that's entirely justified. So what did you feel when you read this? Were you like, I mean, when it's long, I kept reading and it was, I mean, for a paper to do this obviously it's coming out now. This happened in the winter. This was a lot of work. And
so this article came out not long after everything happened. This article was published March 19th.
Yeah.
March 5th.
Well, I just got it. What?
March 5th.
Okay. So, well, I mean, still, this is an amazing bit of reporting.
It is. I'm not surprised that they did so much on it, because this was a big deal in Texas. You know, we felt like news. In other parts of the country, we felt like it got a lot of coverage because it did. But in Texas, like, this was like the center of the world for weeks, because so many people were impacted. Deaths, damage to property and homes, There was national press about electric bills coming out that were in the thousands and thousands of dollars.
Yeah, they basically had to pass a law banning the wholesale.
Yep.
I think it's in here somewhere, but they banned the wholesale sale of natural gas and stuff because of situations like this.
Electricity. Yeah. So I was talking to my friends down there about it when I went down for my birthday in May. And how they described it to me was like they were on for a while, one of the wholesaling electrical companies. And there's some real benefits to that because electrical companies have to continue to produce energy. They can't just stop producing it if there's no demand, because if they do, then they can't ramp up when there's a need to ramp up. So they have to be producing.
Wow, if only we would have done that with the chip shortage.
Right. So they had to be producing electricity anyway. Now, electricity, when it's on the grid, it needs to get used. And so in the wholesale environment, if you're a customer of one of these old wholesaling like electrical brokerage companies, you actually got paid to use electricity during like non-peak parts of the year. So you would get bill credits. And then in the high peak seasons, your electrical rates are more expensive because there's more demand, supply and demand economy. Well, there was a rule or regulation in Texas that you couldn't charge more than a certain amount per kilowatt hour. But when people are burning massive amounts of electricity to try to heat their homes with electrical heat, they burned a lot of electricity, and that's how they ended up with these huge bills. And the way that these were set up is on auto payment. And so people were literally having their bank accounts wiped out when the electric company took their auto payment of their bill. No discussion, no human interaction. It's all automated. There's no compassion. There's no heart. It's just like, hey, you owe us this money. Bam, we're taking it out. So that whole practice went away, and for good reason, because, I mean, it was just ridiculous. And I agree with the state of Texas for getting rid of that practice. It was beneficial for some people. My friends, I was talking to them. The husband thought it was a good thing. The wife thought it was questionable on whether or not they actually really did save enough money to make it worthwhile when they were using that before. The reality of this whole situation, too, which was really interesting, was like all of the finger pointing towards particular sources. And so, like, this article actually dives into quite a bit of what I had already kind of heard, because we got so much national press on this event, which was, the Texas government was blaming renewable energy resources, particularly wind and solar. And it's such a big part of the grid, blah, 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 blah. But was it something like 80% of electricity in Texas that year was supposed to be, or this year was supposed to be produced by
natural gas and
heat generating sources, natural gas, coal.
Right. Which is, I get them pointing the finger at renewable energy, saying, hey, that failed, but like this other stuff failed over here,
And throughout this article, they do multiple times explain like all energy generating sources had failures.
Right.
And it was a massive amount of energy production was dropped. Like you said, they go into a lot of it, but let's see here. This season, the Texas grid was expected to rely on, quote, thermal sources, which are mostly natural gas, for at least 80% of its power when demand is high. Because it's easy to flex, you can bring it up on demand, you can get rid of it, but there was very little accountability in that. Watching a lot of news around that time, because I had friends down there and I wanted to know what was going on, a lot of it came down to the failure of winterizing the power plants. Mm-hmm. So equipment was failing. One of the things I didn't know about that they talk about here is Texas not being prepared for winter. Technicians, mechanics couldn't get out to the equipment that was failing because it was frozen. The roads were frozen. So they weren't prepared to even get out to some of the production areas to do work.
The worst part about all that, it isn't in this article, but I was reading a lot back then about the idea that like these things are relatively cheap, you know what I mean, to winterize this stuff. Like it isn't, if you kept up with it every year, it wouldn't have been, there was really low, like 3-digit figures out there for like this part. You got a lot of these things, but like this part's like $150, you know what I mean? Like it, to winterize these things. And it's just one of those things where, it's weird that they went after the regulatory commission when, they probably should have, because that could have been regulated ERCOT, but like, Yeah, it is weird that I mean, we talk about this all the time. You know, the hammer falls on the people. Like, you know, it always everything runs downhill, right? So like, they're not going to go after the executives. They're going to go after, you know, the people, the regulatory commission for not regulating what happened, which is again a tragic. Like, what the heck, you know? Like, it doesn't make any sense.
And something we talked about a lot at the time that isn't discussed in this article is the fact that Texas's power grid is segregated from all of the states around it. So,
yeah, that was mentioned in a couple articles at the time that I read. That so they can't like call up Louisiana or something and say, "Can we get some power?"
Correct.
You know, or whatever.
It's not as simple for them to work with their neighboring states in an emergency like this. One of the other things towards the very end of the article, actually it's the last few paragraphs, they discuss that in 2011 there was a major storm in Texas that had very similar impacts, but it wasn't as catastrophic. And at that point in time, there was recommendations that had come out to winterize electrical generation equipment, and it still didn't happen. And
right.
So, you know, this was again a very painful lesson to be learned, and a tragic situation where,
I mean, people died.
The way that Texas is set up, the way that Texas is run, and it's very much a free market economy. They want to be a very business-friendly free market economy, which is one of the reasons that the state has such consistent population growth, such consistent job growth, is they are very business-friendly, and so businesses bring their work there. But one of the disadvantages is what we've run into here, right? The government doesn't run utilities as public utilities. They're independent businesses, and because of that, the businesses were given the reports in 2011, hey, winterize, and they made the choice not to because, hey, it's expensive.
Yeah, 9 years ago, basically. At the time,
10.
9 years ago. Yeah, 10 years ago.
And there was plenty of time to do it, you know. And I talked to another friend of mine in Texas about, well, you know, it's the wind energy, and I had read an article like that day where someone had made it's the wind energy case, and you know, I'm not there, I don't know, so I'm going to trust my friend. But since I had just read that article, someone pointed out the incredibly flagrant and flat out point of wind generators work perfectly fine in Minnesota.
Oh, yeah, and they got nasty winters in Minnesota.
They work perfectly fine in Norway.
Yeah, and Norway's also known for incredibly bad winters.
So, like, what are we doing different in Texas? And it's, you know, it's got
apparently a lot. Apparently there's a lot going on in Texas. It's much different than the rest of the country, so.
And, you know, this is a flaw within the free market economy idea, right? Now, it happened.
We'll probably do an episode on the free market economy, but I mean, we're not in a free market economy. I hate it when people say that because we're not.
Well,
there's regulation, there's bailouts,
there's always rules in it, right? Like, we couldn't have a truly free market economy, or we would be living in a world where Penn Jillette is president.
Right. Or, yeah, I mean, yeah. I hate when people go, well, let the market decide. I go, well, it's not really deciding now. There's good or bad, whatever.
But it's not as much as people might think.
I still think that, like, you know, good or bad, the government does intervene, and sometimes for the good and sometimes for the bad, you know. And so, but it's not we're not just letting, you know, we're not just letting people pay whatever they want. This is why I think regulation is important. To bring it back to Texas, like in Washington State, no matter what I feel about my utilities, there is laws in place to make sure that utility companies don't come through and say, you have to pay us another $1,000 a month for natural gas. Like, there's utility laws on the books saying you can't do that. You know, you have to inform. Like, I get letters all the time. In the next couple months, we're going to be upgrading our equipment. This is what your natural gas is going to be. Now, I still have problems with that because I can't shop. But I really had I reevaluated the position after reading about Texas. It's like, do I really want to shop and save money in the winter when, you know?
So you can point out that this is a extreme outlier, right? It's happened twice in the last 10 years. It's not a huge common issue. And to a degree, right, like, what are Texans' options if these companies don't choose to winterize their equipment? Like, they're still stuck, right? They've got to pick with whatever the competition is in the market.
Right.
But this does give an opportunity from a capitalistic standpoint for one of the electrical generators, not ERCOT, but the actual like power companies, to go out and be like, oh, well, we winterized all of our equipment, so we're prepared for a winter at negative 10 degrees.
Yeah.
So your electricity is going to be reliable, even though you're going to pay an extra half cent per kilowatt hour or whatever it happens.
Yeah,
to
I
be.
mean, in Washington, I haven't done it, but a lot of people talk to me about they would sign into a thing with the power company where you'd basically pay. You'd pay more when you were using less power, because that way when you were using more power, your bill stayed the same.
Yeah, they average out your bill over the year, so it's
right. They basically like I get it every 2 months, but they said there's a program where it's every month and they average everything out.
Yep.
Which seemed to work. They said it didn't, but the swings weren't as bad, and they said it didn't seem to be beneficial, but that didn't mean it was bad. It just meant like this is kind of a net gain, but you have the choice to do that in Texas with this system. It's like you now have a $10,000 power bill, and like you said, it was sucking people's accounts. But I have the option to go to my power company and say, I want to do this. I want to sign into it. I want to leave the program. I don't, I've done it for a year. It's not worth it.
Correct. However, you don't have the option to choose a different power company or natural gas company if you're using natural gas in Washington. What you have where you live is your only choice. And so there is that option within Texas of I want to choose a different natural gas provider, or I want to choose a different electricity provider. And then ERCOT regulates the lines because everyone leases the same electrical lines.
Right.
So there's more, not totally, but more of a free market economy when it comes to that. And to some degree, that does benefit the consumer, right? We've proven over and over again, the government does this all the time, that competition is good for people, right? So like the whole merger of Sprint and T-Mobile, or T-Mobile and Sprint, was fought by the Obama administration and the FCC under Obama because it was going to reduce competition at the high end of the cell phone industry, and was not going to be good for consumers. And then the Trump administration, with the new director of the FCC, approved it. And so now instead of having 4 major carriers, you have 3 major carriers. And the government's gone and broken up, like there's famous monopoly cases where they broke up Ma Bell. I mean, that's happening all over. I mean, in movies that happen with Disney, I mean, they're just gobbling up. They pretty much own my childhood now. I don't know what else they could buy. And then in the gaming space, Microsoft bought Bethesda for $4 billion or whatever, and so now they own all of Bethesda and Bethesda's parent company. And a lot of people are talking about like, where's the diverse? Like, again, we don't think that Microsoft's going to make Bethesda games do everything they want them to, but like, where's the? Is there going to be control?
Right. Is there going to be an ability for a small team to be like, hey, we got 10 people on this team, we want to do this thing? I'm sure Microsoft would say yes, but are they? Are they looking at a thing going, well, we make this amount of money if you make another Skyrim or another Elder Scrolls, so you're not going to do that dumb. Again, I don't think Microsoft would do that. I mean, they invested.
But Bethesda might, because they have to answer to Microsoft.
Yeah, or shareholders. Or
why did you, spend this much money developing a game that only produced this much, right? So the point I was getting at, right, is like, governmentally in the United States, like we have this concept of not allowing monopolies, but within our utilities in Washington state, we are completely okay with government being a monopoly in our power energy.
Well, I mean,
provision.
again, that goes to the laws that stops them from raising my rates. So it does suck that I can't go shop for other utilities, but if I know there's a protection in place that says, hey, we can't just come through and raise your rates by $1,000 a month, that makes me feel a little bit better about the situation,
Correct. And so there's like, it's a check and balance situation, right? Like you have one choice, but we tightly regulate that one choice. It does mean that our energy provision in Washington state has less flexibility because they've got to go through the legislature if they want to make big changes. If they're like, oh, we need to spend $380 million upgrading our equipment this year because we found this critical flaw, like they can't just do it. they've got to go to the legislature to do it. Now, in Washington, they're much more likely to do it because the government's going to go, oh, well, this is a huge safety issue and you have to do it. So
Right.
we're going to allow this will
X
happen.
amount of people are
Correct. But there's no
needing this.
there's no other pressure coming from the consumer, right? At the end of the day, my choice, if I want electricity, I pay this governmental entity to have it, which is this kind of like weird pseudo government entity because they're not really, but they are. They're super heavy regulated. I don't know. Like,
Yeah, it's weird. Again, this just gives me to the grand experiment that is Texas. Now with coronavirus, I mean, I didn't bring these articles up, but it's in the news about mask mandates. And Governor Abbott says, we don't want a mask mandate. And now the counties within Texas are like, we're going to require people to wear masks. It's a massive political debate. It's weird that you are forcing people to not wear a mask by forcing them. You're like, do you understand what I'm saying? So it's like, you can't tell me what to do. I want to have my own personal freedom, but don't wear a mask. Like, to me, that's just...
well, it's like, again, on our trip down to Texas, the vaccines had just started to really roll out. They hadn't been opened up to the general population. They just opened up to the general population here in Washington because of the way we structured it.
Right.
So I had my first shot, and I think Lisa had her first shot when we went down for my birthday. And we walked into our hotel, and there's a sign that says, please wear a mask. So we put our masks on, and we walk in. We're trying to check in, and the guy's like, I can't hear you through your mask. So
you're like, but...
took my mask off. The next guy comes in just to ask, like, hey, where his room's at? And comes in, and we look at him. We've got our masks on at that point. And because he had left, like, right before we came in. He was like, oh, don't worry, I'm vaccinated. And Lisa and I'm like, we don't really care one way or the other. He's 15 feet away from us.
Right.
And then the next couple of guys walk in while we're checking in, and they look at Lisa and I with our masks on, and they're like, ugh. Just the look of disgust on their face, like, what kind of a sheeple are you? Right. But talking to my friends that are down there, I've got some other friends that have moved down in the last couple of years, it's about 50-50. Going to the stores that we went into is about 50-50, right? Like, Texas put the power of the decision into the hands of the people, not into the hands of the government. You want to wear a mask? Wear a mask.
Yeah, I don't know.
But there's some disadvantages to that because with COVID in particular, it is really easy for someone who is not currently sick to spread this infection without realizing they've even done it.
Obviously, too, now with the Delta variant, they're saying it's more
contagious,
potent than the Alpha or whatever, the
primary,
whatever, the original variant. So I mean, what do you like? Having lived in Texas and then obviously being back in Washington, like, what do you think? Do you still look at Texas as strange, or like you obviously have friends there, so you can talk to them about the situation? I mean, does this, not that these articles were going to change your mind, but do you think, is it still something where you're like, this is still really strange? I mean, were you there like, okay, well, this is all fine when I'm here, but did you get home and go, I mean, how do you feel about Texas? This is a great experiment, I guess, is my...
I am a libertarian.
Oh, no.
And so...
Oh, no.
On the grand scheme of things, I actually agree with a lot of the ideology on what Texas does, leaving people with more of the freedom and more of the power and less regulation. Right. It doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with the actual culture of it. Texas is a very Republican state, which does not necessarily align with libertarian thoughts and ideals. We're close. Right. On some stuff.
Well, it's getting purple is what I heard too. I was not reading online that it's...
And it is, right? Like, Dallas is far more democratic. Austin, the 8
blocks of Austin is...
Your large population centers are always that way, though, and there's a reason behind that dynamic of what drives metropolitan areas to be more democratic. Right. So, like, I agree with a lot of that philosophy. Like, the roadways, the freeways in Texas are so much better than here in Washington. But how do they do that? Well, they do that because they contract out the companies that build the roads new freeways or toll freeways for a period of time. I think it's 20 years, maybe it's 30 years. And those companies get paid some money from the state, and then they also get to collect the toll money for a certain period of time as well to pay for that construction. So by doing it that way, they're incentivizing the road construction companies, the road contractors.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
To get these projects done and improve transportation. It's super easy to get around in Dallas. Now, if you talk to locals down there, they're like, traffic's terrible. But living here in Washington, no, they have no idea.
Now, you don't know. You don't have a 405, guys. Like,
flip side of that, like, the whole concept of the liberal nanny state, right? Like, we live in Washington State. When I was moving back from Texas, one of the things I didn't like about driving in Texas, even though it was far easier to get around from point A to point B and a lot faster, drivers are way more aggressive. And Texas State Patrol doesn't really enforce traffic laws very aggressively to what I'm used to. I've lived in Washington my whole life. Well, it turns out a month before I moved, I read an article about traffic enforcement in the country, and like the year they had taken the statistics, Texas was like second to last on traffic enforcement. So getting pulled over for speeding, reckless driving, that kind of stuff. And Washington was the 5th highest. So it made sense to me.
Almost polar opposites then on either side of the...
Yep.
Yeah.
It made sense to me that, like, in Washington, people do tend to follow the rules and the laws on the freeway more than they do in Texas. I got tailgated more in Texas than I ever have been in my life, far more aggressively, too. It wasn't just like someone would come up behind you and tailgate you. Like, they'd be right on your butt, weaving back and forth in the lane, waiting for you to get out of the way, even if you were in the middle of passing other slower-moving traffic. If you're going the speed limit in Texas, you're getting tailgated by everybody. I mean, I shouldn't say that's not entirely true, but it's going to happen. If you're 5 over, you're still not the fastest person, because basically everyone's going 10 miles an hour over.
Get in the right-hand lane if you're going 80 and a 70, basically.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. Even through the cities. But I do think, like, a lot of that comes down to kind of the philosophy of Texas again, right? Like, whatever, people are driving their cars. We're just going to kind of let them do their thing, right? Like, I'm a cop here. I'm not here to punish someone because they're going a little bit over the speed limit. I'm going over the speed limit. Whereas here in Washington, there's a very different philosophy on that and enforcement. So, like, yeah, on the grand scheme of things, I really like Texas. I would consider moving back to Texas at some point in time. It's got a booming economy. It's, people talk about it being more affordable, but the reality of it is, and this is really weird, but like property taxes in Texas are crazy high. They're like 3 times what they are here in Washington.
Wow.
Yeah. But a house would be $100,000, $200,000 cheaper. The reality of it is affordability isn't that big of a difference because of the extra property taxes.
Right. So you're basically not gaining anything. It's just moving in you're paying it somewhere else.
Yep. Now, lower sales tax and no income tax is still really nice. And that's an outlier, kind of a weird thing. And that's an area where Washington and Texas are both weird. We have no income tax. The people are generally pretty nice versus the weird standoffishness. Like, there's a lot about Texas I really like. It's freaking hot, man.
I know, that's the other thing. Like, every time you're like, I'll go back there. It's just like people who live in Arizona I don't understand. Like, you always hear these weird stories about Arizona where it's like 120 degrees and people stop working at 11 a.m. They start at 2 in the morning. It's like, I don't want to go through that. I want to see the sun. Which we can't now because of forest fires. But I don't know. Me reading these articles, it was just really weird. It just reinforces that it is like this really weird experiment. And I know a lot of people dunk on Florida.
Yeah.
But this seems to be like Florida is just like news of the weird. This is like legislative stuff, which is really strange. And one thing we didn't bring up that again I didn't know how to. We talked about offline was the lawmakers that left, the Democratic lawmakers that left. They didn't want to vote on the voter suppression rights. That's a big thing in the news, and they just left the state. And it's incredibly performative. But I'm like, what a performative move for everyone to leave, I mean, that no matter what you want to say about, well, it didn't accomplish anything, we were talking about it when it happened, Yep. Do you know they all left? What? That's crazy. Like, why? Oh, because they're trying to pass this voter bill, and the Democrats completely didn't agree with it. And like, what do we do? And then Abbott said, if they come back in the state, I'm going to arrest them. Which there was a lot of talk about if he had power to do that or not. A lot of people think that he did not. I don't know. I didn't read into it. I just thought it was weird that the governor's like, you're going to be arrested. But again, what did them leaving do? If sooner or later they're going to have to vote on that bill. And then a lot of people brought up, well, Texas has a really short session for voting for their, congressional. They have like one of the shortest sessions, I think, so out of the nation. So it's weird. I don't know.
You can still do
it was so weird reading. What?
You could still do a special session.
Yeah, I know. But I don't know. I don't think any of this really changed my mind. It was just everything I thought I heard about Texas, either good or bad, seemed to be true from reading these articles about. It is just a strange experiment that I don't know how it's going to work out, especially now with COVID. I mean, around them in Louisiana, all those places are having an explosion in Delta variants, and with them,
Texas is. Houston, I heard on the radio the other day, Houston was down to having 16 beds for ICU available.
Yeah,
Houston. It's a 6 million population city.
Yeah, and they're like, we're out.
We're down to 16 ICU beds.
Yeah, it's just weird. It's really strange. So, yeah, I mean, I think this is the weirdest episode we've done because I really don't know what to think about reading all this. I just feel the same. It just makes me feel it's even strange. I feel stranger about Texas because it seems like there's these articles about legislation and stuff to back it up as opposed to, Florida's weird and they got crocodiles and I don't really get what's going on down there. Like this is like, no, they passed this law. Florida, man. Yeah, Florida. Like, as a lot of people from the South I know have pointed out, that's like a whole other country even to them, and they're down in the South. So I guess that's it for this episode. So, Avin, what are we talking about next month? It's your turn to pick. I'm putting you on audio blast. I chose Texas. It is now your turn to pick. It's your month. What are we talking about?
So we tend to do more kind of like what's in the news and what we're reading about. And I actually almost called you to say, hey, this is in the news everywhere. You maybe consider doing this as a topic this week. I really want to dive into, and this isn't really in our vein of conservative versus liberal, although there will be some discussion in that because that's how we think. But I really want to dive into what the driving force is behind vaccine hesitancy.
Oh, okay. I'm excited because I've also been on a sideline in a massive YouTube hole just listening to people talk about. I'm listening to debates. I'm reading,
I really want to have a better understanding, right? Like I have some very good friends that are very against the COVID vaccination. They're not anti-vaxxers. I want to clarify that. They're anti-COVID vaccination. And I really want to get into the whole on what's going on with that. So I think that's kind of the pursuit of what we want to do in the next one. By that point, it may not even be relevant anymore, or maybe even that much more relevant.
Well, I mean, again, we have talked about doing stuff kind of about COVID maybe after, but the after, we don't know when that's going to be, right? Because this keeps dragging out. I've read a lot of, like, not just CDC, but other virologists and other people talking about there could be another variant, very much if the Delta variant is hitting. If it swirls around again and hits enough people, there could be another variant. We don't know. We definitely don't want that to happen. I'll definitely. I've been thinking about that too. I have a topic for my next topic that has also been in the news quite a bit. But yeah, that was one of them. So you kind of picked something that was on my short list as well. So yeah, vaccine hesitancy. I'm looking forward to that. So what do you want to plug before we get out of here?
Well, same thing I always plug, pretty much, my real estate business, your agent guide, both traditional real estate services and agent matching service, which is where I started off at, where I have kind of the most passion.
Is that the new one, the matching? Because I've done your
agent matching is what your agent guide, my real estate business started off at. So matching people up with a professional agent in their area. So that it's someone that they're working with that they know they can trust, that they know has experience, that they know isn't just fly-by-night. Like, just to throw out a statistic, it's like 88% of real estate agents fail within their first 5 years, and something like 90% of real estate commissions paid in the United States are earned by the top 50% of real estate agents.
Right.
So
well, it almost seems like it's inertia sometimes where you're on a streak and you know, it's word of mouth, right? Like, I had a good thing with this person, I had a good experience with this person, and you just keep using that person, you know.
I mean, definitely.
And
we
also
could go
for
in
you,
far more in depth into that. That's obviously not what we're here for today.
Are we gonna have a real estate podcast, or is that the second podcast we're doing together? I mean, I'll just listen to you the whole time. I'd be like, houses are cool. Being dry during the winter is cool. I don't know about a lot about it.
I like not being outside.
Yeah. So yeah, go there, check your stuff out.
Yep. Youragentguide.com.
Yeah. I'll just plug what I always plug, the Gaming with Grief podcast with Joseph Carlson. I talk about games and stuff on there. It hits my website, which is gamingwithgrief.com. Every Monday morning at 7 a.m. I actually this has to do with you, Evan. I had to re-upload the episode that you and I talked about Activision Blizzard because there was a problem. It was a mistake I made with editing where I turned the volume down, so it went from like a normal constructive conversation at a normal level, and for some reason at the end I wanted to do a fade with the outro music, and I faded your whole conversation. So as we were talking, it sounded okay, and then it sounded like you were walking away from your mic as you were talking, and I was trying to, but I re-uploaded it. They both actually hit today, and so if people want to listen to that, you and I talk about the Blizzard Activision thing, and the new episode actually hits iTunes a little early, so that hit, and that's a follow-up because there's been a lot of fallout from that. People have been let go. I know this is our political thing, but just to let you know, not only has J. Allen Brack been let go, but 3 designers from Activision Blizzard let go. One of them was the Diablo 4 director. The other guy was he was in that picture of the Cosby suite that we talked about.
Yep.
He got let go. Jesse McFadden or Jesse McCree, he is actually one of the designers on Overwatch, and the character Jesse McCree in Overwatch was given his name, and he has been let go because he was also in that photo of the Cosby suite. And one other person has been let go. I didn't write their name down. I talked about it in the episode, but there's been a lot going on. There's been another lawsuit by the investors, it's crazy. So I had to do another episode about that, and I'm getting more listeners. So
cool.
I had somebody from Huddersfield, UK, which I don't know where that is. I had to look it up, and somebody from Tel Aviv listened to the show, and they just checked right before I got on because I had to make sure everything published. I had 7 people in the Bay Area listen to my podcast, which is pretty crazy. So my chart went from like 0 and then spiked up. So hopefully those people listen. But if you like gaming and you like talking about sad things, come to my podcast. There's 2 things that we love doing. And I think that's it. If you guys want to write to us, remember this is a Grief of Politics podcast. This has been episode 8. We talked about Texas. What a grand experiment it is. If you want to write to us, just leave a comment below the episode at thegriefofpolitics.com. Or you can go to GWG Podfellows. Tell us about what episode it's about, and that you want to talk about the Grief of Politics, because that's my other email address, and I don't want to pay Google for another another address when people aren't really using the Grief of Politics one or the Game with Grief one. So just go to GWG Podfellows and write us there. Anything else, Avin, before we sign off?
No.
Cool. Well, I'll make sure I don't make the auto mistake, and I guess we'll talk to you guys next month when we talk about vaccine hesitancy.
All right. Have a good day, everybody.